Now let's look at the derivation of the cofunction identities. So we start with our cosine of the difference identity. We have the cosine of beta minus alpha is equal to cosine of alpha cosine of beta plus sine of alpha times sine of beta. Now if we make a substitution and let beta equal to pi over 2, when we plug it in the identity, we obtain cosine of pi over 2 minus alpha is cosine of alpha times cosine of pi over 2 plus sine of alpha times sine of pi over 2. Now this cosine and the sine of pi over 2, we can evaluate those. We know that the cosine of pi over 2 is 0 and the sine of pi over 2 is 1. So what that leaves us with then is that cosine of pi over 2 minus alpha is sine of alpha. If we then make a substitution, another substitution, and let beta equal pi over 2 minus alpha, so that if we just switch the sides of alpha and beta, we get alpha is pi over 2 minus beta. If we take these values and plug them back in for the expression that we have here for the identity we just found, then we have cosine of beta is equal to sine of pi over 2 minus beta. And so that gives us two of the cofunction identities. So now if we go to the reciprocal identities, remember that we've got secant of theta is going to be 1 over cosine, and cosecant of theta is going to be 1 over sine of theta. So if we start with a secant, if we look at the secant of pi over 2 minus alpha, then that's going to be 1 over the cosine of pi over 2 minus alpha. But using the identity we just found, the cosine of pi over 2 minus alpha is the sine of alpha, we just switch to sine of alpha, but then using the other reciprocal identity, 1 over sine, gives us cosecant of alpha. If we do the same thing for cosecant, cosecant of pi over 2 minus alpha is 1 over sine of pi over 2 minus alpha, but then using the cofunction identity for sine, we see that the sine of pi over 2 minus alpha is cosine of alpha, and 1 over the cosine of alpha gives us secant of alpha. Now, coming back to the quotient identities, if we remember our quotient identities, we have tangent of theta is sine of theta over cosine of theta, and cotangent of theta is going to be cosine of theta over sine of theta. So we do the same kind of substitution. We say tangent of pi over 2 minus alpha is sine of pi over 2 minus alpha over cosine of pi over 2 minus alpha. But then using our cofunction identities, sine of pi over 2 minus alpha becomes cosine of alpha. Cosine of pi over 2 minus alpha becomes sine of alpha. And so coming back to our quotient identities, cosine of alpha over sine of alpha is cotangent of alpha. We can do something similar for cotangent. Cotangent of pi over 2 minus alpha is cosine of pi over 2 minus alpha over sine of pi over 2 minus alpha. We apply our cofunction identities, so cosine of pi over 2 minus alpha becomes sine of alpha. Sine of pi over 2 minus alpha becomes cosine of alpha. And sine over cosine gives us tangent of alpha. And so what this gives us now is the remaining cofunction identities. So we have secant of pi over 2 minus alpha is cosecant. Cosecant of pi over 2 minus alpha is secant of alpha. Tangent of pi over 2 minus alpha is cotangent of alpha. And the cotangent of pi over 2 minus alpha is tangent of alpha.